Let me tell you about a morning in October of 1994, in a corner of Montana most people have never heard of, and fewer still have driven through. Meagher County, high, dry country, where the Castle Mountains rise up on one side and the Crazies stand blue on the other. And the wind comes down out of the peaks in the fall with a sound like somebody dragging a long sheet of tin across the sky. It was a Saturday, the kind of October morning where the sun is bright but it's got no warmth in it, and the sage dust lifts off the gravel every time a truck door slams. There was a smell in the air of horse sweat and warm diesel, and underneath that, the faint, sweet smell of somebody's coffee going cold in a paper cup. Behind the old 2-dot livestock pavilion, on a dirt lot that had been graded flat for the occasion, about 70 people had gathered for what the bank was calling a ranch liquidation. Now here's what you need to understand about that crowd. There were 3 men in suits who had flown up from Denver the night before. They were ranch investment buyers, the kind who work for partnerships with names made out of initials, and they had already decided between themselves which parcels they were going to walk home with. There was a Texas cattleman who had a satellite company checkbook and a laugh you could hear across a parking lot. There was an outfitter down from Bozeman who was trying to put together a hunting operation and needed the north bench to do it. And then there were the neighbors, 24 quiet men and a few women, most of them in work coats and muddy boots. Most of them there mostly to watch. What was being sold was the Halvorsen estate, 4,200 deeded acres, broken up into 7 lots by the bank's attorney, and tied up in a family dispute for 11 years before it finally shook loose. At the heart of it was the old Halvorsen home place, a collapsing log headquarters, a shut-up stone spring house, and a board and batten barn that old Ingvar Halvorsen had padlocked in the spring of 1983, and that nobody, not the heirs, not the bank, not the lawyers, had opened since. The 2 crown lots were the ones every serious bidder had circled. Lot 4, the home place, which came with water rights on Willow Creek, and the 1,100 acres of North Bench, which came with a deeded Forest Service lease that you couldn't buy at any price anymore. The Denver men wanted them, the Texan wanted them, the Bozeman outfitter wanted them, and everybody in that crowd, including the neighbors, assumed one of those 3 was going to drive home with them. Then Wyatt Crowell got out of his truck. Wyatt Crowell was 63 years old that morning. He drove up in a 1974 Ford F-250 with a crack running clear across the windshield, and a red heeler dog in the passenger seat that would not get out of the cab no matter how long Wyatt held the door open. He was wearing a sun-faded denim jacket, boots that had been walked over at the heels for so many years the leather had taken the shape of his stride, and a sweat-stained Stetson with a hole worn clean through the crown above the right ear. A hole about the size of a quarter. You could see daylight through it. The local people knew him. He ran 180 head on 600 acres of ground his father had homesteaded up above the creek. He still moved his cattle on horseback when every neighbor for 20 miles had gone over to four-wheelers. He carried no debt. He had turned down 3 solid offers to sell across the decades. The last one generous enough that most men would have sold their mother to take it. And he had said no without even sitting down. One of the Denver men murmured something to the other. I wasn't close enough to hear the words, but I could see the smile. The Texan saw the hat and chuckled into his coffee. A neighbor standing near Y looked down at his own boots and pretended he hadn't heard a thing. The auctioneer started on the small lots first, the way they always do. Warm up the crowd. A 160-acre parcel went to a young couple from Ringling. A little irrigated piece went to the outfitter. Then came Lot 4. The auctioneer opened the home place at $410,000. The Denver men and the Texan went to work. You could see it was choreographed the way they climbed that ladder. 450, 500, 575, 6 1/4, 700,000. The kind of steady, confident climb that was meant to make any local in that crowd take one look and decide to keep his hand in his pocket. At $740,000, the auctioneer scanned the crowd the way they do, already raising his hand to close. And Wyatt Crowell raised one finger, $750. Heads turned, not all at once. First the neighbor beside him, then the ones behind him, then slowly the rest of the crowd, the way a ripple works its way across a stock pond. The Texan looked over like he'd heard a bird he didn't recognize. $800, said the Denver man. $850, said Y. $900, said the Texan, and he said it a little harder, the way a man does when he means to end a thing. $925, said Y. And he said it without blinking. There was a silence then that I want you to picture. 70 people on a dirt lot. And for about 4 seconds, the only sound was the wind coming down out of the castles, and one loose piece of tin rattling on the pavilion roof. The Denver men looked at each other. The Texan looked at his coffee cup. The auctioneer looked at Y, then back at the suits, then back at Y. "965, said the Texan. Quieter now. Y raised his finger. 980. The Texan shook his head. Lot 4, the home place with the barn, went to Wyatt Crowell at $980,000. 10 minutes later, when the auctioneer opened the north bench, Y did it again, outlasted them. Let the Denver men climb. Let the Texan try one hard run. Took it at $1,420,000. 2 lots. The 2 everybody wanted. He paid with certified drafts drawn on a small community bank down in Lewistown, where he had quietly built up deposits for 31 years. He folded the receipts into his inside pocket. He walked back to the truck where the dog was waiting, and that afternoon he drove up to the padlocked barn alone, stepped down out of the cab, and laid his open hand flat against the weathered south wall the way a man greets a horse he's waited a long time to ride. Now, I could tell you that's the story. Man in a holy hat shows up with $2.5 million in the bank and buys what the out-of-towners came for. Good story. Satisfying story. But that's not what this story is really about. The real story is what Wyatt Crowell had been waiting on for 38 years. To understand what Wyatt Crowell was waiting on, you have to go back to the summer of 1956. He was 14 years old that summer, long-legged, too thin. The kind of boy whose wrists stuck out of his shirt cuffs no matter which shirt his mother put on him. His father had sent him down the creek to old Ingvar Halvorsen's place to hire on for the branding and the summer gather. $1.50 a day, plus board. That was the wage. Let me tell you what the Halvorsen outfit looked like back then, because it matters. It was at its peak. The log house stood squared and tight, the chinking fresh, the roof sound. There was a working blacksmith shop with a real forge, and a full set of tools hung on the wall in the order a man would reach for them. A stand of old cottonwoods ran along Willow Creek where it bent around the home place, and in the heat of the afternoon the shade under those trees was the coolest spot for 10 miles. There was a windmill turning steady above the stock tank, and everywhere, all day long, there was the smell of scorched hide and sage smoke, and the lather that comes off a horse that's been worked right. Ingvar Halvorsen was 68 years old that summer. He had been born in 1888 to Norwegian homesteaders who had come up out of Minnesota with nothing but a wagon and a milk cow. He had lived through the winter of 1919, when the snow came in October and didn't go out until May, and he had lived through the drought of 1934, when the wind peeled the topsoil off half of Montana and carried it east. He had come through both of those without selling a single acre. He was a widower with no living children. He was slow to speak. And he was. Every one of the men who worked for him said the same thing. 2 moves ahead of whatever conversation he was in. Y worked for him 4 summers. 56, 57, 58, and 59. And across those 4 summers, Ingvar taught him the kind of country knowledge you can't get out of a book. He taught him how to read a storm coming off the crazies 3 hours before it hit. He taught him how to tell sound timber by tapping it with the head of a hammer and listening. He taught him how to find a reliable spring by watching where the elk bedded down at first light. And he taught him how to judge a horse by the way it stood when nobody was watching it. Because a horse will tell the truth about itself when it thinks it's alone. But the night I want to tell you about came in September of 1959. Y was 17 by then. It was his last summer on the place. The gather was done. The calves were weaned, the hands had been paid off, and most of them had already drifted back to town. It was just Y and Ingvar at the supper table that evening. And when Ingvar finished eating, he set down his fork and said, "Boy, I want to show you something before you go." He lit a kerosene lantern. He walked Y out across the yard to the big board and batten barn. He pushed the main door open, and then he took Y up the plank stairs into the upper loft. Now, when a man tells you he's taking you up into the loft of a barn, what you expect to see is hay. Maybe some old tack. Maybe a hen's nest somebody forgot about. That's not what was up there. What was up there was a full working shop and a storehouse built right into the roof beams. A long oak workbench ran along one wall, oiled so dark it looked almost black in the lantern light. In the corner stood a cast iron forge, clean and dry and ready to light. There were crates of hand tools along the floor, every one of them wrapped in oilcloth, every piece laid in the order a man would want to find it. Chisels, planes, farrier gear. a full set of draw knives. On the wall in a scabbard hung an 1886 Winchester that Ingvar's father had carried up from Texas in 1889. On the floor next to it sat a cedar trunk full of letters. Letters from an uncle of Ingvar's who had ridden with the 7th Cavalry. 3 saddles on wooden trees, old but sound, the leather still holding oil. And along the back wall, in wooden racks from floor to roof, were the stud books and breeding ledgers. 40-some volumes. Every horse, every bull, every cow, every lamb that had been bred on that place going back to 1901, written in Ingvar's father's hand, and then Ingvar's own. And underneath the ledgers, in tin cans sealed with wax, was the seed. Heritage grasses and grains that Ingvar had kept alive through every dry year. Blue stem, turkey red winter wheat, black amber cane, a dozen more besides, each dated in Ingvar's square, careful handwriting. Y stood there in the lantern light and didn't say a word, and Ingvar let him stand. Then Ingvar sat down on the edge of the oak bench, and he said what he had brought the boy up there to say. "Boy," he said, "fat years make a man think the country owes him a living. Lean years remind him it was only the weather that was kind." And he laid out the 2 rules. "Never bid on another man's panic," he said. "That's the first one. And what you hold back matters more than what you put to market. That's the second one." He said it simple, the way he said everything. And then he walked Y back down the stairs, locked the barn up, and in the morning Y rode home. Now, what Y did with those rules across the next 24 years is a story for its own. He married a woman named Alma Swenson in the spring of 1962, and the 2 of them bought 600 acres out of a foreclosure sale that Y refused to rush. He walked the ground 3 times in 3 different seasons before he ever bid on it. He ran a small registered Hereford program off bulls he picked the way Ingvar's ledgers had taught him to pick them. He built up his deposits at that little bank in Lewistown, a calf check at a time. And he kept his mouth shut while the rest of the valley went a different direction. Then came April of 1983. Ingvar was 94 years old by then, thin as a fence rail. He drove his old Willys up the 2-track to Y's place one afternoon, and he sat in the cab for a long minute before he got out, the way old men do when the step down from a truck has gotten to be more than they want to think about. Y came out of the barn and met him in the yard. Ingvar reached into his coat pocket and brought out a brass key on a braided horsehair fob. He put it in Y's palm and closed Y's fingers over it. "When my people finally quit fighting and this place comes up," he said, "you be the man standing there with the money in your hand. What's in that loft is yours. I picked you the summer you were 14. He didn't wait for Y to answer. He turned around, climbed back into the Willys, and drove off down the 2-track. 6 weeks later, he was dead. Y went into the mudroom that evening. He drove a finish nail into the doorframe about shoulder height, and he hung the brass key on it. Now, what you have to understand is that the estate didn't settle in 6 months. It didn't settle in 6 years. Ingvar had 2 nephews and a niece and a grandnephew who all wanted different things, and none of them wanted to give an inch. And the whole thing went into a probate fight that dragged on and on and on. 11 years. 11 years that key hung on that nail in the mudroom. Y walked past it 4, 5, 6 times a day. He never took it down. He never moved it. He never mentioned it to anybody, not even to Alma, at least not that I ever heard. But across those same 11 years, and the 21 that came before them, the rest of the valley was making its own choices. And those choices were going to come due. And that's where this story turns. Now here's what you need to understand about patience. Real patience, the kind that runs across decades, doesn't look like anything from the outside. It doesn't look wise. It doesn't look disciplined. It doesn't look like a man making careful choices. What it looks like to the neighbors is a fellow who's a little soft in the head, a man who doesn't quite get it, a man who's being left behind. That's what Wyatt Crowell looked like for 38 years. Let me tell you who was watching him. West of Y's place, out on the big flat, lived the Bellwether brothers, Rance and Owen. Their grandfather had come into that country the same decade as Ingvar's father, and the Bellwethers ran a good outfit. Rance was the older brother, the one who made the decisions. Owen was quieter and did what Rance said. South of Y, down toward the bend in the creek, were the Dutrys. Mother and father and 4 grown children. And the pride of the outfit was a string of horses the mother had built up over 20 years. Quarter horses with good papers and better dispositions. People came from 3 counties to buy a Dutry colt, Across the creek on ground his grandfather had taken up in the original allotment was old Merle Casper, sheepman. Ran a band of Rambouillets up into the high country every summer and brought them back down every fall, the same way his father had, and his grandfather before him. All three of those outfits had known Ingvar Halvorsen. All three of them, at one time or another, had been offered some version of the same apprenticeship Y got. A summer's work, a few evenings in the loft, the two rules. None of them took it. Rance Bellwether thought Ingvar was a crank. The Dutry father thought there was nothing a Norwegian sheep fence mender could teach a horseman. Merle Casper liked Ingvar well enough, but thought the old man was stuck in a century that was already gone. So when the boom came, they were ready for it. And why wasn't? The late 1970s. Beef prices climbing every quarter. Inflation pushing the value of dirt up faster than a man could keep track of. The ag banks down in Billings and Great Falls lending against appreciating land the way a barkeep pours on a Friday night. Every rancher in that valley was getting a letter a month from somebody who wanted to finance his expansion. In 1978, Rance Bellwether mortgaged everything he owned and bought the 2,800 acres that lay between him and the county road at $650 an acre. And he stocked it heavy. Heavier than the ground would carry in a dry year. But there hadn't been a dry year in a while, and Rance had stopped thinking there ever would be again. That same summer, Merle Casper sold off his good sheep string, the whole band, and with the proceeds and a 7-year note from the bank in Harlowton, he bought a full fleet of new haying equipment, swather, baler, a new Ford tractor with a cab and a radio in it. Merle told everybody at the cafe that he was done freezing his tail off on a horse behind sheep. He was going to put up hay and sell it to the men who were still fool enough to run livestock. The Dutrys took a little longer to make their move, but they made it. In 1980, they sold the horse string. The whole thing. Every mare, every colt, every stud. They used the money and a fresh bank loan to put in pivot irrigation across their best bottom ground and plant it wall to wall in alfalfa. The pivots cost more than their house had cost when the grandfather built it. And through all of this, Wyatt Crowell was out there on 600 acres, running 180 head of registered Herefords, moving them horseback, putting up his own hay with a 1964 New Holland baler that his father-in-law had bought used. Alma was still putting in a garden every spring the size of a small pasture, and canning every fall until the cellar shelves groaned. You could hear the dry laughter at the Stockyard Cafe in White Sulphur Springs. Wise out there ranching like it's the Hoover years, somebody would say. Not mean, just puzzled. The kind of laugh a man laughs when he genuinely cannot figure out what the other fellow is doing. Why heard it? He'd go home. He'd walk into the mudroom. He'd look up at the key on the nail, and he wouldn't say a word. I'll tell you a scene from the summer of 1979 that sticks with me. A syndication man drove out from Denver in a rented Lincoln Continental. He'd heard about why from somebody, probably one of the neighbors who couldn't understand why a man would sit on 600 acres with that kind of water, when he could be levering it into something. The syndication man wore a tie. He had a leather folder. He sat at Y's kitchen table for 45 minutes and pitched a grazing syndicate share deal. The kind where you put your land into a pool and draw quarterly distributions and never have to worry about a calving season again. Y let him finish. He walked him to his car. He shook his hand. Then he walked back in the house, took the man's business card, and pinned it on the mudroom wall next to 14 other cards just like it. A little wall of paper. Every one of them a man who had driven a long way to explain to Wyatt Crowell what he was doing wrong. Then the weather turned. 1981. Paul Volcker, down at the Federal Reserve, took interest rates past 18% to break the back of inflation. He broke more than that. He broke every ag loan in the Mountain West that had been written on the assumption that the good years were going to last. 1984. Beef collapsed. Cow-calf men who had been making money hand over fist in '79 were suddenly underwater on every head they owned. Let me walk you through what came for each of those families. 1985. Rance Bellwether's operation folded. The bank took the 2,800 acres back, and then it came for the original place too. And on a cold April morning, Rance Bellwether stood at his own cattle guard and watched a line of semi-trucks haul the last of his cows down the road. His son Hayes, 12 years old, stood on the porch and watched his father watch the trucks. Hayes never forgot what his father's face looked like that morning. 1986. A repo crew out of Billings drove up to Merle Casper's place at 4 in the morning with a lowboy trailer. By the time the sun came up, they had the swather and the baler and the Ford tractor on the lowboy, and they were rolling back down the county road. Merle's wife waited until the trucks were over the last cattle guard before she let herself cry. 1988. The Dutrys sold out. An absentee owner from California bought the whole place through a lawyer in Helena. He pulled the pivots out within the year, let the alfalfa ground go to weeds, and the house sat empty for a decade. Through all of it, Y watched. Hard quiet. No gloating. No I told you so at the cafe. He'd tip his hat to Rance Bellwether when they passed on the county road, and Rance would tip his back, and neither man said anything about what had happened. But every month, Y was adding to the account down at Lewistown. A calf check. A hay check. The little bit Alma made selling eggs. By 1991, he had $610,000 put by. By the time the Halvorsen estate finally broke loose of probate in 1994, he had just under $2.5 million. Built one deposit at a time across 31 years. And then, in February of 1992, Alma died. She was out shoveling the walk one morning. Heart attack. She was gone before Y could get his boots on and get to her. 61 years old. Y put the garden in that spring anyway. He canned what she would have canned. The jars came out a little cloudy where hers had been clear, and he lined them up on the cellar shelves in the order she had always lined them, and he didn't talk about it. 2 years later came that bright October morning in 1994. The certified drafts folded in his inside pocket. 31 years in the making. Alma 2 years in the ground. And the hole in his hat no wider and no smaller than it had been the year before. Now he had the land. The key was still on the nail in the mudroom. And on Monday morning he was going to take it down. The Monday after the auction, Wyatt Crowell walked into the mudroom and took the brass key down off the nail for the first time in 38 years. He held it in his palm for a minute. The braided horsehair fob was stiff with age, but it hadn't rotted. The brass had darkened to almost the color of an old penny. He put the key in his coat pocket, whistled the dog up into the truck, and drove the 9 miles down the creek to the Halvorsen home place. He pulled up at the barn. He climbed down. He took the key out of his pocket and walked over to the padlock. And he couldn't turn it. The padlock had rusted shut. 11 years sealed up on top of 21 quiet years before that. The key still worked, but the lock itself was gone. Y stood there for a moment, and then I'm told he laughed just once. A small dry laugh, because sometimes the thing a man has carried for 38 years turns out to be the wrong tool for the last 10 feet of the road. He walked back to the truck. He got the bolt cutters out of the bed. He came back and cut the lock off. He put the pieces of the lock in his coat pocket next to the key, because a man like Wyatt Crowell doesn't throw those two things away separately. Then he pushed the barn door open and climbed the plank stairs into the loft. Now here's what he found. Dust. Yes. Mouse sign along the baseboards. A few places where the roof had taken a little water over the years and stained the floorboards dark. But underneath all of that, the loft was exactly what Ingvar had shown him by lantern light in September of 1959. The oak bench still stood square. The forge only needed a wire brush and a new bellows to fire. The tools were still wrapped in their oilcloth, and when Y unwrapped one chisel to check, the edge was still bright. The 1886 Winchester was still in its scabbard on the wall. The cedar trunk of letters from the 7th Cavalry was still where Ingvar had set it down. The 3 saddles were stiff but sound, the leather waiting for oil. And along the back wall, in the wooden racks, were the 40-some stud books and breeding ledgers. And underneath them, in tin cans sealed with wax, was the seed. The seed had waited. The ledgers had waited. The whole of it had waited, on the patience of one old Norwegian, and one boy he had picked the summer the boy was 14. Word of what was in that loft started traveling through the valley that winter. A range scientist drove up from Montana State in Bozeman a few weeks later. He spent half a day in the loft with Y, looking through the ledgers and reading the labels on the tin cans. When he came down the stairs, his hands were shaking a little, and he had to sit on the running board of his truck for a minute before he trusted himself to drive. 2 of the native blue stem strains in those cans, he told Y, and one of the winter wheats had been listed as lost by the state's germplasm program since the early 1970s. Presumed extinct. Not in any bank. Not in any collection. Not growing anywhere anybody knew about. A gun collector drove up from Cody, Wyoming, and offered $60,000 cash for the Winchester. A Civil War historian called all the way from St. Louis about the cedar trunk of letters. The Denver men sent a land attorney very polite. with a letter asking whether Mr. Crowell might entertain an offer on the North Bench now that the dust had settled. And the county that had called him touched for 38 years started calling him shrewd. Now, I want to pause here, because this is the part that matters. Wyatt Crowell was never the villain of that valley story, and he was never the hero either. He was only the one they could see clearly, and what they saw, when they finally saw it, made them uneasy about their own choices. A man who had sat quiet while they were all building and borrowing, and who had ended up with everything they had been chasing and more. It didn't feel good to look at. It wasn't supposed to. Then came a cold Thursday evening in the middle of January. Wyatt was in the kitchen making supper when he heard a truck with a bad muffler come up the 2-track and stop in the yard. He looked out the window. It was Hayes Bellwether, Rance Bellwether's son. Hayes was 34 years old by then, working the counter at the feed store down in Harlowton, driving a truck that was older than he was. Hayes got out, stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and took his cap off. He held it in both hands the way a man does when he doesn't know what he's come to say. Wyatt came out on the porch. "Mr. Crowell," Hayes said, "I just want to know what you mean to do with all of it." Wyatt didn't lecture him. Wyatt never lectured anybody in his life. He just laid it out. The Winchester and the letters, he said, he was going to keep. They'd go to his brother's grandchildren when the time came. The shop tools and the forge he was going to donate to the vocational program at the school in Martinsdale, because Rance Bellwether himself had learned to shoe a horse in that shop in 1959. And it felt right for the tools to go back to where boys were still learning. And the seed, Wyatt said, he was going to split. Half of it he would send down to the state's germplasm bank in Bozeman, so that whatever happened to him or to his place, it would be safe. The other half he was going to give back, tin by tin, to the 14 families whose grandfathers had grown it out on this ground before them. The Bellwethers and the Dutrys and the Caspers and 11 more. On one condition, Wyatt said. If the crop takes, you save next year's seed, and you pass a tin along to a neighbor. Hayes stood there in the cold with his cap in his hands and his breath coming out white. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said the thing he had been carrying since he was 12 years old. "My dad always said," Hayes said, "that the old Norwegian up the creek had seen the crash coming and hadn't warned anybody." Wyatt looked at him. He took a long breath, and then he said the thing he had been walking toward his whole life. "Hayes," he said, "Ingvar warned every man who would listen along this creek for 20 years running." Most of them laughed him off, and laughing at an old man's caution is a bill a family pays across 3 generations, not one. He paused. "A man can save the seed," Wyatt said, "or he can save his pride. He cannot save both. Your father saved his pride. I'm giving you back the other thing." That was all he said. Hayes put his cap back on. He got in his truck. He drove home. That spring, tins went out to 14 ranches up and down the drainage. Some of the grain took, some of it didn't. The turkey red came up beautiful on the old Bellwether ground. The black amber cane came up on the Dutry place. A couple of the blue stems wouldn't go at all, and that was all right, because half of every can had gone down to Bozeman to be kept safe. The little seed and ledger library up in the Halvorsen loft grew. Wyatt opened it by appointment to anybody who wanted to come look. In 2003, Wyatt took his grandnephew Beckett up the plank stairs by lantern light. Boy was 12. Wyatt gave him the 2 rules, the same 2 Ingvar had given him, and then he added a third one of his own. A thing saved, Wyatt told him, is only finished being saved when it has been given away once. Otherwise it isn't a legacy. It's a hoard. Wyatt lived 11 more years. He'd sit on his porch at last light, and a mile across the draw he could see the kitchen window lit up at Hayes Bellwether's place. Hayes had bought back a piece of his father's old ground by then, a little at a time, working at the feed store and running 40 head on the side. The 2 of them would raise a hand to each other across the draw, wordless, night after night. Wyatt died in 2014, 83 years old. It was Hayes Bellwether who climbed the loft stairs after the funeral and found the note folded on the oak bench, addressed to him. The note is private. I won't tell you what it said, but I will tell you this. If you drive down to White Sulphur Springs today, and you go into the Meagher County Historical Museum, and you walk to the back of the main room, there is a glass case under a low light. Inside that case are 3 things: a brass key on a braided horsehair fob, a single sealed tin, labeled in square, careful handwriting. Halvorsen Turkey Red, 1961. and a sun-faded Stetson with a clean quarter-sized hole worn through the crown above the right ear. The card underneath reads, Wyatt Crowell, 1931 to 2014. They laughed at his hat. He bought what they wanted and gave away what was inside.